Thank you, Kat. So I'm not a doctor. I'm not sure how that got in my bio, but I just want to be clear on the outset. So I am a certified family elder mediator. I'm a certified senior advisor, a conflict coach, and for most of my career, I practiced law, but I haven't done that in a while. So good morning, everybody, and welcome on this beautiful day. My name is Nicole Lance again, and I am speaking to you for about an hour. If you've got questions along the way, please jot them down, put them in the chat room. I'm happy to address them after the presentation. And if anyone would like a copy of the presentation, email me and I will provide you a slide deck. So just a little background on me. Following an earlier career in law, I decided a few years back to get into elder care consulting. And I saw firsthand how poor communication really affected relationships and made decision-making difficult. And so I started researching best practices in order to help my clients improve communication and decision-making. And I found out about this wonderful field of elder mediation, and I was immediately hooked. So I get to help people who are in conflict get information and resources that they need in order to make informed decisions. And I help them take down walls, build bridges, improve their relationships, and figure out how to solve problems and challenges that present themselves. And I really love this work, which is why I do it. So if you'd like to know more, you can check out my website, which is www.mediateforward.com. Oh, so there we go. So let's take a look at a roadmap for today. So I want to begin with an observation. So many people come to Avenidas and they do so in order to get substantive advice about caregiving, about health and legal issues. And Avenidas has a lot to offer with regard to advice. But today's focus is really different. It's really on how to have transformative conversations with family members about difficult topics. And these are conversations in order to clarify what's going on, what people want to do, how to resolve the outstanding issues between them. And as one client put it to me, at a minimum, make a bad situation a little less bad. So in practice, it's not so easy to have transformative conversations where you get clarity and understanding and resolve issues. And so that's why people seek out elder mediation as a way to do that. And so looking at this roadmap, we're going to start by looking at some common family challenges. And then I'm going to give you an overview of elder mediation. So sometimes it's called family mediation, sometimes it's elder mediation. I'm just going to use the term elder mediation, but they're interchangeable. And then we'll dive into the core of elder mediation, which is really about using communication skills effectively. And then we'll take a look at conversation in 3 specific areas: finance, care, options, and driving. And we'll finish with a few reminders during COVID. So let's look at a couple common challenges. Maybe some of these look familiar to you. Finances, that can be who's paying for what, who gets it. Sibling disparities, usually siblings are not always in the exact same situation, so there's friction about those disparities. Care, what are roles and responsibilities, what should be done. Driving, there are big conflicts, obviously, between an older person's need for autonomy and their children sometimes feeling like there's a safety concern. Communication is a big issue. Challenges about how to, communicate and share information. And oftentimes there are real disputes around the question of fair. What's fair? What makes it fair? So these are common challenges, and these are the common responses to many challenges. We've got conflict, denial, and confusion. So why is it so difficult to deal with these challenges? So the answers are many. I imagine some of you can relate to these explanations, but Sometimes the issues themselves are complicated to understand. Sometimes the problem is that issues bleed into one another, that an issue is not simply legal, but it's got financial aspects to it as well. You've got emotions, strong ones, they're often below the surface and not easy to identify. Anxiety, fear are two common ones. You've got family dynamics, people entrenched in behavior that's gone on for years, and problematic communication styles. And then finally, issues of trust, autonomy, and we mentioned before, questions of fairness. So what is family, otherwise called elder mediation? So it's a conversation that sometimes rises to the level of a negotiation between family members, and it's facilitated by a neutral third party, preferably someone that has background in the area being discussed. And that person helps the parties figure out what's the information and the resources that they need in order to address their issue, and helps the parties, after they come up with an agenda of what they want to tackle, brainstorm, look for options, and figure out what their goal for the get together is. And we'll talk about goals for mediation in more detail in an upcoming slide. So what is it about elder mediation that helps facilitate what I'll call transformative conversations? So a colleague of mine puts it this way, and I'm just going to read this slide because I think it is really profound and captures what can happen during mediation really well. So a major benefit in mediation is the simple presence of another person. Sometimes I can ask questions that a child or a parent can't ask of the other, just because there's a lot of history, people are uncomfortable, people are defensive. So just the simple presence of another person is really, can be transformative. With a neutral third party in the room, participants feel safer to express what they want and need. And when people feel less afraid, they are less defensive and more willing to negotiate. They're freer to apologize. They're freer to make requests and bring up sensitive topics. So let's take a look at elder mediation more closely. So there are 5 main principles. It's voluntary. No one makes you go to mediation. It's confidential. The mediator is neutral and represents each party equally. And this is a little bit what makes it different than other types of professional help, where the professional is primarily representing the older person or the patient. In mediation, the mediator represents each party equally. So the adult child's concerns are of the same weight and merit as another sibling or an older person. Upholding self-determination for each person is very important. And informed consent is an important aspect of mediation. And that's why one of my jobs as mediator is to help people figure out what information do they need in order to make an informed decision. So mediation, there can be many goals of mediation, and it can range from, in the case of a family that has been arguing a lot, just simply having a better quality conversation with everybody in the room is a big win, because it hasn't happened, or it hasn't happened in a long time. To then, going a step beyond that to actually being able to frame an issue nicely in a way that everybody can agree to, and then explore options, to actually moving beyond just the exploration of options and actually reaching agreement, temporary or permanent, in part or in whole, about whatever's at stake. A good mediator also has strategies for working with high conflict people. And we can talk more about what high conflict people are, but it's a term of art that Bill Eddy of the High Conflict Institute has written a lot about. And So that's good to know. And then finally, mediation, though it has some therapeutic value to it, is definitely not the same thing as therapy and counseling. So let's assume for this conversation that your family has asked a mediator to step in, facilitate a mediation, and you have some issues you want to discuss, options to brainstorm. What next? The next slide, we're going to talk about communication skills, because this is really the guts of mediation. And this is your job number one during the mediation, is trying to the best of your ability to use good communication skills. And it's what your mediator is going to model for you and help you to develop. And so when we look at these three skills, these are the three things that are important: to ask thoughtful questions, to listen well, and to make thoughtful statements. Okay, so let's start with listening. So I just want to start off by saying that it turns out that many of us think we're good listeners, but we're actually not. So Steve Covey, the author of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he sums it up really nicely. He says, most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. Communication experts tell us that, in fact, most of the time, we don't listen well. On average, we listen about 25% of the time, listen well. And when we're at home or in familiar surroundings, that can drop to 10% of the time. And in addition, we tend to only listen well for about 20 minutes. And that's if the topic is something that interests us. So we're not yet at 20 minutes, but, and hopefully I'll be able to get you to listen beyond 20 minutes. But those are some of the stats that I think are really sobering. And so we have to work hard in order to listen for understanding. And that means, and you'll hear me use this term over and over again, we need to have what we call a learning conversation. And a learning conversation is really where you're not focused on what your arguments and your positions are, but you're really focused on, for yourself and for the other person, trying to understand what are the needs, what are the concerns, what are the feelings that are relevant, what are the values at stake. And I just want to say on this point that a lot of people will say, well, I don't want to listen because I'm mad at the person, or I've heard it all before, or, who cares? I'm not willing to spend that energy on that person. And I get that, it's human nature. And so the response really to that is that if you don't want to do it for the other person, really just do it for yourself. Because the research is really clear that if you want someone else to listen to you deeply, you have to show them that you're doing the same thing for them. So listening to the other person is really important in order to achieve your own personal goals, not simply to be nice. So in order to show somebody that you're in fact listening well, you want to, with all its nuances, you want to be able to, for example, summarize for them, what you've heard them say. You want to acknowledge specifics. And sometimes, as the saying goes, actions speak louder than words. You can do something by action that illustrates to the other person that you've actually listened to what they've said. So let's take a look at the second skill. So these are questions in order to understand. So asking good questions is a prerequisite for a learning conversation. Without asking good questions, you're much less likely to get at a durable, workable agreement that works for everyone. So what are good questions? So they include questions that clarify situations. So here we've got 5 types of questions that are really important. So there are questions in order to get information, like what actually happened. There are questions to interpret the meaning of what was said. You know, what did you think was meant when so-and-so said what they did? There are questions to understand feelings. And there are questions to learn more about a person's concerns, their interests. And again, this is not the argument or position, and we'll get into some examples of the difference. So for example, a question to understand a concern about fairness could be something like, well, tell me more about how what you say or what you propose makes it fair. And finally, we ask questions in order to get clarity about behavior. So a question like, if we do what you're proposing, what does that actually look like? Or what happens if what you're proposing to do doesn't actually happen? What then? What are the consequences? So on the next slide, we'll see some examples of questions designed to bring clarity. And you'll notice that in the questions we look at, there are no why questions. And that's really important, not to ask too many why questions, because you tend to go down a rabbit hole of past history and then get bogged down people just perceive the past in different ways, and it's not super helpful. So here are some sample questions that are really effective in order to understand what's going on. Questions like, what do you need? What matters to you? These are questions to understand someone's interests and concerns. And the third question, do I have this right, can be very effective when someone repeats themselves often, because when they repeat themselves often, it tends to mean that they don't feel heard. And so if you ask, do I have that right? Or is there anything that I missed? It reassures the person that you are in fact listening to what they are saying and want to understand what's important. They feel heard. And when people feel heard, like we said, they can open their minds to doing the same for you. So, and you've got here a couple more questions, and they could be 100 long. I mean, if we were doing a mediation about whether or not it might be time for mom to move to assisted living, there could be questions like, what are the placement options? What does mom prefer? What do the kids prefer? What does my own family prefer? How do finances figure into that? So the list of questions is endless. A third skill that I want to talk to you about are statements for understanding. So during mediation, or even outside mediation, if you're just trying to have this conversation on your own, anytime you're trying to have this learning, productive conversation, use I statements wherever possible instead of you statements. So instead of saying you did or you said, because when you do that, people are less likely to listen and they become defensive. So you want to set, instead of saying you screwed up by not doing X, Y, and Z, you use I statements and talk about how you feel. Next, and statements. So after someone has made their point and you want to transition to something you think of, which may be quite different, instead of responding with I disagree or that's BS, add the word and then start talking about what's important to you. And it may seem like a small point, but it really can make all the difference. So where two people have opposite perspectives about a situation, it can be really helpful to reframe for a third way. And so what that means is, instead of one person saying, mom is getting sufficient care, and the other person saying mom is not getting sufficient care, because you're not going to bridge that gap, you can reframe into a statement like, there's an issue about what level of care is appropriate and whether it's being met. And that's an issue that everybody can then agree upon, and then you can start focusing attention on, what are the relevant factors, and start brainstorming for options. And a final point about feelings, and really this could be its own presentations, so I'm going to just try to nod to it, but it is really important. They're often below the surface, and people are not explicit about what their feelings are, whether it's love or anger or joy or loneliness. But when you name the feeling, then you can start having a real conversation about what the need or the concern is. So that can be super helpful. So another point, acknowledging feelings can go a long way to making someone feel heard. So just saying something like, I see you, you are sad, or it looks like there's a lot going on, can be very useful. Okay, so we covered 3 communication skills, and this all works well if everybody at the table is kind of alert and understanding. But what happens if an older person is at the table and it's clear that they don't understand everything that's going on, what the issues are, the options? What do you do then when there's a question about capacity? So capacity is a complicated issue, and experts with a lot of training disagree upon, when it's present or what to do about it. It's difficult. And so what a lot of people are using now is this supported decision-making model. And this is a teamwork approach for assisting people with mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia in communicating their thoughts, and a way for them to participate in decision-making to the maximum extent possible. So this model recognizes a person's autonomy and capacity to take part in decision-making in some way, and it allows a person with a disability to use a friend, family members, professionals. It could be a network of other trusted people. It's a team to help them make decisions. And these supporters help the person understand issues. They help clarify options. They explain things in ways the older person can understand, and they help the older person communicate decisions to other people. And this model recognizes that mental capacity is not black and white. It's on a continuum, and the capacity to read a 50-page document, for example, is quite different than the capacity needed to make a decision about whether to take a walk outside or do something much simpler. So if you're trying to deal with a situation involving a parent with mild impairment, by all means, seek out an evaluation by a neurologist before you make any decisions yourself about their capacity or ability to make decision making. And ask instead, does the person have capacity with support? Can we help this person make decisions so that they understand issues and choices, can ask questions and communicate? That's really where the focus is. So just to recap, we've talked about 3 different kinds of communication skills and how to support an elder's voice. And now I'd like to look at 3 common areas where people struggle. So these are common mediation topics, difficult conversations: financial management, the area of care options, and driving, when and how to stop. So here are 4 topics that can be difficult to discuss. So the first is the issue of having a financial surrogate, someone who will take over when a person is no longer able to handle their finances or chooses not to handle their finances. So the appointment of a financial surrogate, someone with power of attorney over financial matters, as well as power to contract. And the reason I mentioned contracting as relevant to this power of attorney is sometimes people think that the person who holds the healthcare power of attorney has the power to enter into contracts with a nursing home or assisted living, but really the excuse me, the power of contracting is part of the financial power of attorney typically. And so this issue of having a financial surrogate is really important because it deals with the finances, including also signing contracts related to care options. So it's vital for everybody to have a financial surrogate. And if there is no financial surrogate, sometimes children don't want to pry into their parents' business. It feels uncomfortable. Parents don't want to bring up the topic themselves. And so it's really, it's difficult. If a financial surrogate is already in place, and there's documentation about that, it still can be necessary to have a conversation because sometimes the financial surrogate doesn't even know they're appointed or what they need to or can do as a practical matter to take over when the person they're supposed to be a decision maker for no longer can. And sometimes the financial surrogate hasn't really had the conversation with the person about what their values are and what they actually want when they're no longer able to make financial decisions for themselves. And finally, even when there is a financial surrogate in place and those discussions have taken place, there can be, and it's in use. So there's someone actually who stepped into being managing financial affairs. Conflict can arise among children about how money is being spent. So there's a lot of potential conflict there. The second topic is whether or not there's enough money for retirement. And there are questions about proper oversight of assets and debt. And the fourth category of common issues are really ones about inheritance. Those often come up during a parent's lifetime. I read an article recently from Forbes that was quoting a bunch of financial advisors saying they're seeing talks about inheritance come up before one or both of the parents have passed away much more now than in the past. And they think that's partly due to the fact that fewer people feel like they've got a retirement of their own that they can rely upon, and they're kind of really relying upon their parent. And so that's why these issues are coming up more during people's lifetimes. So given all these kind of issues that can come up in a financial context, how does a mediator facilitate a conversation? So these next few slides are really going to be about communicating about financial management. And we're going to start by distinguishing between positions and interests, which we talked about before, but now we're going to make it concrete in this example. And we're going to look at some conversation starters that can be helpful in helping people work through denial and privacy barrier concerns. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about overcoming other kinds of communication barriers. So we're still in finance, but we're going to really hone down on some communication skills. Okay, so here are just a couple positions on the left column and interests on the right column. I'm trying to illustrate the difference. So let's say there's a dispute between siblings about how much money should be spent on mom's care and whether it's time to move to assisted living, let's say. So a position is someone saying mom should spend money however she wants. The interest that really underlies it could be an interest that the adult child has in protecting mom's autonomy. The next example of position, mom should stay home and not go into a nursing home. So what's actually behind that position? So it could be a couple of things. It could be concern about an ability to pay for future care. It could also be an interest in mom's autonomy. The next example, mom loved you more, she gave you more. That could be a concern about fairness going forward. I could give you a dozen more examples, but I'm just trying to give you these three to illustrate that it's much more useful and helpful if you can try to get away from positions and really speak in terms of what is the interest or the value or the concern that's underneath it, because then you can start to see where there's some commonality and seize upon that, or it becomes more clear, where the real difference is, and you can try to figure out ways to address. Okay, so let's talk about denial. So this is the first barrier that I want to talk to you about that can come up, and I want to we'll talk about a couple strategies for dealing with this. So what is denial? Denial is a strong psychological coping mechanism that makes it such that families don't confront what they need to, and they ignore a problem in plain sight. So what are the types of denial that we see? There's denial about needing additional resources for your future care. There's denial about the need for a financial surrogate, the denial of a need for financial management. And there can be also denial that, if you don't say something now and talk to your kids about their inheritance or how you see your legacy, that they will probably fight after you pass, and you could have predicted it, but you were in denial about it. So these are forms of denial. And what's really interesting is there's a report from a few months ago out of Stanford's Center on Longevity about what prevents people from doing advanced financial planning. And they take a look at how important a role denial plays in preventing people from planning. And this is what they say. When adults are healthy and fully capable, regardless of their chronological age, they often do not consider the help they need managing their money, or they intend to make a plan following a health problem or trigger event. Contributing to their procrastination is a deep-seated need for independence, autonomy, and dignity, traits that are signaled by being in charge of one's finances. So denial is very strong. And even when people get bad news about there's a health event and they get bad news about cognitive impairment, they maybe had a cognitive test, that tends to not make them more willing to address issues. It makes them less willing because they don't want to face reality. According to the report again, denial can be strong even after bad news about performance on cognitive tests. Giving up financial control threatens one's self-identity and forces people to confront vulnerability. People just don't want to think about dying. They don't want to think about getting older. So the good news, though, is that we have strategies for overcoming denial. So here are just a couple examples of language. So we've got this first sentence: Mom, it's important for you to choose someone for when something unexpected happens in the future. So what do you see in this that is useful? First of all, you're avoiding using depressing words like telling your mom she's got dementia, because the research, again, according to the Stanford report, is pretty clear that telling someone that they've got cognitive impairment, whether it's dementia or anything else, actually is not an effective way to get them to listen to and really have a real conversation about what maybe can be done. It may be true, but it's not helpful. So here the adult child is making a universal appeal. they're saying it's important to choose someone because something unexpected can happen in the future. Well, something unexpected can happen in all of our futures. And so kind of putting it in those terms makes it less about, their incompetence and more about, hey, good planning is just smart to do because something unexpected could happen to any of us. The next sentence, it would relieve my stress and give reassurance that if something unexpected happens, things will get sorted out the way you want. That's a great sentence because you're making it clear that you're trying to honor your parents' wishes, right? If they take action and plan ahead, then when something happens, things can get done according to their will. So that's a nice appeal to a parent's interest. So we're going to switch now to another big area of concern. So we talked about denial. So privacy is also a big deal and can prevent productive conversation. So two primary reasons that people are sometimes reluctant to disclose financial information. They either worry about disclosing their wealth, thinking that it may prevent their adult children from managing on their own and being independent. But sometimes secrecy is driven by the opposite situation, not that there's a lot of wealth that someone doesn't want to disclose in case it makes adult children less interested in work, but it's secrecy driven by shame around debt and low savings, and perhaps the inability to pay for retirement. So those are real barriers to conversation, and older adults often resist planning because they want to keep that financial information confidential. So how much transparency can one expect, should one expect? And as a general rule, some transparency is advisable. And people draw the line kind of differently in terms of, how much they share, whether they give numbers or not. So disclosure really varies upon the circumstance. It's often not necessary to disclose all personal financial details. You don't need to give all numbers. What's important at a minimum is to be clear about what your financial values are and what your wishes and needs and desires would be for the future as much as possible. So here are a few examples of language that adult children can use with parents when there's a privacy concern. So I understand you want privacy, but at the same time, we need to make sure that there is enough money to pay for future care. So what's great about that sentence is it acknowledges two legitimate needs. It acknowledges, a need for privacy, but it also acknowledges reality. And there's no judgment or blame. It's just the way it is. So now, where do we go from here? We still have a job to do. The next sentence, if privacy is an issue, or if you are afraid of possibly hurting feelings, there's a way to plan while still keeping privacy. So that sentence acknowledges the need for privacy and says, again, there's still a job to do, and let's try to do it while honoring your privacy. So those are two possible sentences. Here are a few more. Dad, we have no desire to know your financial personal details now, no desire to interfere. You're acknowledging where the parent is coming from. We just want to make sure, and this is critical, we want to make sure that you choose someone to help you when you no longer can, someone who knows your financial values, needs, and expectations. So you've said, I get that you have privacy as an important value, but you got to make sure that there's someone there that can take over when you no longer can. And the person's very clear in the last sentence. We want to make sure that whoever you appoint as your financial advocate has instructions on how to access information when needed. So those are a couple ways to have a conversation with your parent about finances that address privacy and denial concerns. So finally, we'll look at a few additional ways to overcome communication barriers. So these examples on the right, or the bullet points, these examples of effective messaging come from the Stanford report that I mentioned earlier. So they tested these on different people. Effective messages are ones that emphasize the benefits of planning. So by appointing a power of attorney and talking to a surrogate about your values and your needs and when you would like them to take over, the more likely that your wishes will be followed in the future should the need arise. So there you're emphasizing the planning benefits. You may want to explain negative outcomes from not planning, which means depending upon, for example, how financial assets are held, you may need to go to court in order to access cash to pay for their care or do other important things. And then finally, older adults tend to be more open to conversation if they understand that planning ahead will reduce burden on future decision makers. So, Dad, I want to honor your wishes. In order to do that, you know, I need X, Y, and Z, and it would really help me if you do that, because then there aren't going to be big fights and additional burdens having to go to court, etc. So these are 3 ways to effectively message with your parent. So let's move on now from finances to a different kind of conversation about care options. So I've named a few, there are more, but one's just how to best manage at home. The next is looking at whether it's time to move, and then end of life conversations. Paula, how are we doing on time? Okay, all right. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So managing at home. So I want to talk a little bit about fear. It comes up in these kind of conversations, but in many others as well. So fear often gets in the way of a productive conversation. And in their book, Love's Way, elder mediators Carolyn Parr and Sig Cohen identify some common fears. I wonder if any of you can relate to these. So there's the fear of making a situation worse, the fear of hurting another person's feelings, the fear of alienating the other, the fear of being wrong, the fear of having to change, and the fear of your own or another person's anger. And so those fears are real and they're strong. And the authors recommend, and I certainly agree, that it's helpful for each person to really name their fear with as much specificity as possible, because it lays a groundwork for a productive conversation. So let's look at an example of how that works. So let's say you approach your sister about sharing the cost of a helper for mom, but you want to approach her about the subject of cost sharing, but you're afraid that she'll resist or she'll become defensive or angry. So what you can do is you could start the conversation maybe over lunch by describing your concern in non-judgmental language, and then ask your sister how she sees it. So if you're in mediation, the mediator will help you do this. If you're outside mediation, this is what it might look like for you. So you might say something like, when I visited mom last week, I noticed dirty dishes all over the kitchen and very little food in the fridge. I'm worried. What do you think might be going on? And then listen listen to what your sister says, and just follow wherever the conversation leads. And during that first conversation, you may or may not get to the topic of cost sharing, but you can offer to gather some information and meet again to talk about it. And these are small steps, but they will make you less fearful of the next conversation. And that's the whole goal, while also increasing your knowledge about what's happening with mom and exploring your sister's willingness to do anything about it. So that conversation is super productive, and it all starts with first acknowledging and overcoming your fear in baby steps. Okay, time to move conversation. So the question is the time to move. This comes up often, provokes anxiety. And here's one way to have a productive conversation. So let's say a daughter wants her mom to move. She doesn't think living at home is safe anymore, but mom doesn't want to move. So instead of saying, oh, and I should say, so these 4 bullet points, these are all things. The first 3 are things we've covered before. And as I go through this example, see if you can, see if you notice where there's a position versus an interest or concern being raised. See if you can tell where there's some reframing of conversation that's going on. All right, so instead of saying, Mom, it's time to move, the daughter might pause, back up a moment, and consider really what mom's needs are. And then reframe the conversation, whether it's in her own head or out loud with her mom, as she speaks to her, along the lines of, instead of mom needs to move, how can mom stay in her home or in her neighborhood and also give me peace of mind? And once mom and daughter agree upon that main challenge that's been reframed, someone can maybe do a little research, explore options. Those options could include visiting a care facility nearby, just in case, to see what's available. And then the daughter and mom can move forward in order to see what next steps can be. And ultimately, the solution may not be to move, and maybe they hire a healthcare aide, maybe they adapt to make the house safer. It's unclear where this conversation will go, but it's all going to end up in a better place if it starts with a reframing that moves from one person's position to a statement that includes everybody's interests and concerns. So end of life, this is a really different kind of conversation. And we're talking about, obviously, when a loved one can't speak for themselves and they have not expressed in writing or verbally what their wishes are, or maybe they have and there's disagreement. And these issues are really complicated and beyond the scope of today's presentation for the most part, but I felt like I should give a nod to it, especially given COVID. And I just wanted to share briefly how an elder mediator might ask some questions to give you that kind of perspective. So from an ethical and a legal perspective, the focus is on mom's wishes and what would she want if she could communicate here at end of life in terms of her care. And so the first thing to really be aware of is that it's extremely hard for most people to really separate their own personal views of what they think is right from what actually their parent would want. It's just really hard to do. But in trying to parse out what a parent would want in a situation like this, here are some questions to consider. Can you discern any of mom's beliefs about treatment based upon statements she made during her lifetime about the care of others in crisis, or just from how she lived her own life? Is there anything in that experience that helps you discern what she would want. You might think about, did she ever make relevant I statements? So did she ever say things like, I would never want to be on a respirator. I would never want to experience pain for a long time. Or did she say, I would never want to miss a moment, even if I couldn't move much or say much. So did she make any I statements? And then finally, you might consider religious beliefs and separating maybe tenets from a faith in general from whatever personal faith your parent may have had. So those are just a few considerations at end of life that I felt I would be remiss if I didn't mention briefly. Okay, and finally, our driving conversations. So these conversations, as many of us know, can be incredibly difficult because there's a clash of wills. The adult doesn't want to give up their autonomy, and adult siblings and maybe others have real safety concerns. So the general advice here is to start these conversations early and have them often, be incredibly thoughtful about who brings up the conversation, because parents tend not to listen well to children often in comparison to other trusted people. But let's just dive into a few points here. So there's research out at MIT that these are the times when older people say they're ready to listen. So if you see any of these factors in your own situation, they can be good indicators that the time for conversation is right. So the biggest ones are really if a person's had incidents of forgetfulness while driving or had a significant change in health, they're more open to having a conversation. And let's talk about a few conversation starters. So this could happen within mediation, or this could happen outside of mediation. But again, the focus is on needs and concerns, which you see kind of in bold here. But these are sentences you could use with your parents, or that a mediator might help you during mediation. We're concerned about your safety and know that when we express these concerns, it feels like control. That's acknowledgement. And no one likes to feel like they're losing control. We want you to feel independent. Here's some more conversation starters. I like the last one. Feelings aren't all that matters. They are difficult. They're troubling. We still have a job to do, which means making sure that driving doesn't harm anyone. And again, the slide deck will be available, so don't feel like you need to write all these down. So in any conversation, anticipate a lot of pushback. Don't take it personally. This is actually one area where using a mediator can be great, because the mediator doesn't take it personally and they're not going to get as much pushback as other family members. So here are more questions that are good to ask. Do you think you are a safe driver? Would it be helpful if other people drove you sometimes? These are clarifying questions, and they're non-judgmental. I really like the last one. How much longer do you think you can drive? And sometimes, just to acknowledge the truth, these conversations aren't going to be resolved well. And if there really is an immediate safety issue, maybe the answer is going to be the keys have to be taken away or the car disabled, and there's nothing much you can do about it. But at least everybody got clarity about the situation and did their best. Which leads me to a final point about outcomes of mediation, outcomes of these learning conversations that we're talking about. So by using the communication skills that you've learned here today, by having more productive conversations, you will at a minimum be able to get more clarity. And remember, we talked about clarity in 5 major areas: clarity about what's happened, clarity about how to interpret events, clarity about feelings, behavior, interests, needs. Beyond clarity, you will be wise. So you'll be wise because of all this clarity. And beyond that, you'll be able to have a more civilized conversation, a discussion of options, and sometimes even agreements about communication and how decisions will be made, and even temporary or final agreements on the substantive matters. So before we recap, I just want to give you two more thoughts. During COVID, many of us are lonely right now. It's a real concern. And there's a group founded by a friend of mine here in Menlo Park. It's called Friendly Voices, and it's volunteers who have conversations with people once a week about whatever they want to talk about. And it's kind of a nice way to connect. And then my last thought is, please, if you don't already have power of attorneys in place for healthcare decisions or financial decisions, it's a good time to do so. So in conclusion, let's look at the roadmap. We've talked about family challenges, common ones. We've discussed mediation overview, 3 main communication skills: asking questions, listening, making powerful statements. We've looked at these 3 specific areas: the finances, care, and driving, with a few COVID reminders. And that's it. I will leave you with a few last thoughts. There is no one path. We each go our own way, navigating these conversations in order to achieve clarity and improve conversations and decision making. And it's super important. I always tell clients to remember that these are not 1 or 2 conversations necessarily. They take place over time, and it's a process and it's a journey. And it's super important to remember that, so that you don't get frustrated when you can't fix something right away. And finally, be kind. I think we all need to be kind to ourselves and to our family. And that's it. Next steps, if you'd like a copy of the slide deck, you've got my email there. If you'd like any of my educational materials, I've got, for example, a guide that's got about 24 conversation starters for different scenarios. I've got a bunch of different guides. I can give them to you. Or if you'd like to talk to me, I offer a complimentary consult. Please be in touch. And I'm going to take a sip of water here, but I'm ready for questions. I've jotted down a couple in case they interest anyone. And then I thought also maybe we'll take a little poll right now. And if you want, put in the chat box, what is your most difficult conversation about? What prevents you from discussing it? And what would help you have this conversation? So maybe people want to take a couple minutes and put things in the chat box, and then we'll take some comments or questions.